Wait a minute. I'm going to ask you a question. Do you think the team that wins the World Cup is really the best team? Most of us would answer yes, without even thinking, because we've been told the same story for years. If you have the best players, you'll win the trophy. But here's the interesting part. When you look at World Cup history, that story falls apart over and over again. Some teams were full of stars, but they went home early. Others had squads that looked weaker on paper, yet they were the ones who lifted the trophy. SOY? Luck. The referee? Or just a great coach? Note in recent years, sports scientists, data analysts, and even researchers working on network theory began studying World Cup winning teams one by one and hundreds of matches, thousands of players, millions of passes, and in the end, they noticed something very interesting. Almost all championship teams shared certain common traits that kept appearing again and again. And here's the strange part. While watching matches on television, most of us don't even notice them. Today, I'm not going to tell you the usual cliches about what makes a good team. Team spirit, hard work, big stars. Put all of that aside, because what we're about to talk about isn't the visible side of football. It's what happens behind the curtain. In fact, once you learn some of these things, you'll want to watch old matches again. Because this time, you'll look at the same moments with completely different eyes. Let's begin. 1. Champion teams aren't as young as you think. Now be honest. If I told you today, build the squad that will win the World Cup, you'd probably start listing young stars who are 20 to 22 years old, because the football world keeps selling us the same story. The new Messi. The new Ronaldo. A 17-year-old super talent. A 19-year-old future star. Without realizing it, people start believing one thing. The younger you are, the better you are. But the World Cup doesn't really follow that rule. In fact, it says the exact opposite. When scientists compared World Cup winning squads over the years, they discovered a very interesting pattern. Most of the players who formed the backbone of championship teams were between 27 and 31 years old. A coincidence? Not really. Because for a footballer, the most dangerous age is neither being very young nor very old. The most important stage is the absolute peak. At this age, it's not just a player's legs that become stronger. Their brain starts reading the game much faster as well. They can sense what the opponent is about to do before the ball even reaches their feet. They don't panic. Their hands and legs don't shake in a World Cup final. That's where the difference is made. Think about Spain's World Cup winning squad in 2010.
Xavi,
Iniesta, Xabi Alonso, David Villa, Puyol. They were all right in that age range. The same was true for Germany in 2014.
Lahm,
Schweinsteiger, Hummels, Boateng,
Khedira.
They were all at the perfect balance between physical power and experience, because the World Cup isn't just a tournament for those who run the fastest. It's a tournament for those who make the fewest mistakes. And here's another interesting thing. Research shows that players at this age don't just make better decisions. They also make far fewer mistakes under pressure. So what really changes with age isn't their reflexes, it's the way they take risks. That's why a 21-year-old player might try to dribble past an opponent and lose the ball. Meanwhile, a 29-year-old player makes a simple pass in the exact same situation and takes his team to the final. That's exactly the difference we can't see from our television screens. Most of the time, the World Cup isn't won by the fastest players. It's won by the players who make the right decision at the right moment. And that's only the first common trait. Because the next one completely destroys one of the biggest myths that football fans have believed for years. 2. Having possession isn't enough to win the World Cup. Now I'm going to tell you something. When I first heard this, I didn't believe it either. I even said, no way. Because for years we've been told the same thing. If you keep possession of the ball, you'll win the match. In fact, what's the very first statistic we look at right after a match ends? Possession percentage. If one team had 65% possession, wow, they dominated. If the other team only had 35%, they played badly. But scientists looked at this from a different perspective. They analyzed all 128 matches from the 2014 and 2018 World Cups one by one. Ball possession distance covered the market value of the teams, and in the end, the result was truly surprising. None of these, by themselves, explain why teams win matches. Yes, you heard that right. The team with the most possession doesn't always win. The most expensive squad doesn't always reach the final. The team that runs the most doesn't lift the trophy. So, what does the winning team do? That's where things get interesting. According to the research, the things that change the outcome of matches are completely different. Winning one-on-one duels, winning the ball in the right areas, avoiding defensive mistakes, applying pressure at exactly the right moment, and most importantly, forcing the opponent to make mistakes. When you think about it, actually makes perfect sense that a team can have 70% possession. But if they're constantly passing the ball around in their own half, that doesn't scare the opponent. Meanwhile, if the other team reaches the opponent's goal in just 3 passes after winning the ball, that's when the danger begins. So the real issue isn't whether you have the ball. It's what the ball does when it's with you. And there's another fascinating detail here. When scientists examined the passing maps of championship teams, they noticed a remarkable pattern. Most people think every ball goes to one superstar, but in reality, it's exactly the opposite. The center of the passing network keeps changing. One moment the midfielder is controlling the game. Then it's the fullback. Then the center back. Then someone else again. The opposing defense suddenly starts thinking, who's getting the ball next? And the moment they can't answer that question, their structure begins to fall apart. Scientists call this a distributed network structure. I know it sounds like a computer science term, but the idea is actually very simple. If a computer network depends on a single server, everything stops when that server goes down. But if the workload is spread across many computers, it's much harder to bring the system down. That's exactly how championship teams play. Think about Spain in 2010. You stop Xavi, then Iniesta steps up. You shut him down, Busquets starts building the play, and if that doesn't work, the fullback moves inside. In other words, the opponent's plan falls apart before it even begins. Germany had a similar structure in 2014. The ball didn't depend on the feet of just one player. It kept moving from one player to another. That's why the opponent couldn't figure out which player to press. And here's the interesting part. We almost never notice this while watching on television, because our eyes are always focused on the player carrying the ball. But coaching staffs look at something completely different. They don't focus on who has the ball. They look at how many passing options the next pass has. That's one of the details that makes World Cup winning teams different. They don't play in a predictable way, but they're not completely chaotic either. They constantly leave the opponent with a small amount of uncertainty. And that's one of football's most dangerous weapons, because defenses can stop what they know. But stopping what they can't predict is much more difficult. But there's something even more interesting here. Most championship teams don't actually start the tournament looking like champions. 3. Champions can start the tournament poorly. And that might actually be a good sign. Now, let me ask you a question. If a team loses its first World Cup match, would you still believe it could become champion? Most of us already know the answer. It's over for them. Social media immediately fills up with comments. This team has no chance. They were never really favorites. The bubble has burst. But World Cup history tells us a completely different story. In fact, many champions didn't begin the tournament looking like champions at all. Take Spain in 2010, for example. Today, that team is considered one of the greatest national teams in football history. But do you know what happened in their first match? They lost 1-0 to Switzerland. Just imagine it. The tournament favorite loses its very first match. If it happened today, social media would explode. Xavi is finished. Iniesta has gotten old. This system doesn't work. We'd probably read all of those comments, but a few weeks later, that same team lifted the World Cup trophy. Here's another example. Argentina in 2022. Messi was on the stage. The first opponent, Saudi Arabia. Everyone expected an easy victory. But the result? A 2-1 defeat. Perhaps one of the biggest upsets in World Cup history. That day, millions of people said the same thing. This Argentina isn't going anywhere. And just a few weeks later, Messi was lifting the trophy. Oh, how does that happen? How can a team play so poorly in its first match and then become the best team in the world? This is where a fascinating concept from sports science comes in. Tournament peaking strategy. In other words, reaching your peak at exactly the right time during the tournament, because the World Cup isn't a league. You don't play 38 matches. It isn't spread over an entire season. IT takes place over about 1 month. And if you spend the same amount of energy in every match, you won't make it to the end. Think of it like a marathon. Nobody runs the very first kilometer at full speed. If they do, they'll be walking during the final kilometer. The World Cup works much the same way. Successful coaching staffs don't push their players to 100% in the opening match. Instead, they gradually raise the team's physical and mental level as the tournament progresses. The real goal isn't to be the best team in the first match. It's to be the best team in the final match. That's why some teams may look ordinary during the group stage. They might even seem boring at times. But once they reach the quarterfinals, they suddenly rise to a completely different level. Because that was the plan from the very beginning. And it's not just physical. The teams begin to get to know each other better. The players stay in the same hotel. They go through the same training sessions. They begin to understand each other's movements much better. A pass that's played half a second too late in the first match can be made with eyes closed in the semi-final. It's not just the fitness that improves. It's the team's chemistry. And from the outside, that's something that's very hard to notice. There's another interesting detail. Most teams that start the tournament poorly don't panic, because they're not planning for just one match. They're planning for the entire tournament. As fans, however, we make our judgment after the very first 90 minutes. Maybe that's the biggest mistake. The first match only tells us about that day, not about the championship. And now for the next common trait. In my opinion, this is the most surprising one on the list, because for years we've heard things like, Messi won the match by himself, or Maradona won the World Cup all by himself. But when scientists analyzed the passing networks of championship teams, what they discovered was very different from that story. But we're not done yet. We still have 7 more points to cover. They'll be in part 2 of this video if you want to see the rest, and if you enjoyed this video, let me know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe.